The last game in the programmable series, Mach Rider, makes its debut. Mach Rider's name and general concept was likely taken from the Japanese exclusive Hasbro Mach Rider toy called the Mach Rider that Nintendo licensed in 1972. The futuristic-looking car would be loaded into a launcher and shot out at high speeds, hence the name. Outside of these two traits, the similarities end pretty abruptly. The actual video game is filled with guns, women, and aliens. This begs the question, what could possibly appeal more to Americans? Mach Rider was the second racing game to make its way to the NES after Excitebike. Unlike the multitude of colorful, happy-go-lucky games that debuted with the console in 1985, Mach Rider embodied a grungy post-apocalyptic setting. It wasn't a simple racer. There were enemy aliens that could be shot at and obstacles to avoid, adding more action to the mix. Plus, the future of the human race lay in your hands, at least according to the manual. The game seemed to be tailor-made to appeal to an American audience, and by looking at the development history behind the title, this could very well be the case. Mach Rider was developed by HAL Laboratories, a name we've seen quite a few times in our journey. HAL also worked on the very similar looking title F1 Race in 1984. However, this basic racer would never see a US release. Americans just don't really care about Formula 1 racing. But rather than let a game with a solid engine and controls go to waste, HAL and Nintendo decided to repurpose F1 Race to work better for an American market. There is no way for me to unequivocally prove this, but by looking at the two games back to back, it's pretty clear how they have a lot of overlap. Mach Rider was released a year after F1 Race and added several new features to the base game. For example, while F1 Race only had 2 gears, high and low, Mach Rider had 4, allowing for more precise shifts in speed. Mach Rider also added a rear-view mirror, replacing the map view, which was instead shown at the beginning of each stage. The game functions as both an evolution and Americanization of its predecessor. In addition to distinguishing itself from F1 Race, Mach Rider looked to separate itself as much as possible from pre-video game market crash hit Pole Position. Pole Position was one of the first and most influential racing games, cementing itself as a must-have for home consoles in the early 80s. As we've discussed previously, Nintendo did anything and everything to keep themselves as far away from this era of video game history as physically possible. While Mach Rider certainly comes off as a new take on the racing genre, F1 Race was a much more generic-feeling title, and almost acted as the Famicom's answer to the Atari game. The popularity of Pole Position was immense, so it would be within Nintendo's best interest to bring a similar-looking racing game to the NES. However, something like F1 Race, which shares many blatant similarities to Pole Position, could remind retailers of a time they were terrified of repeating. So, in order to best appeal to both consumers and retailers, Mach Rider was conceived. Again, this is entirely speculative, as neither Nintendo nor Satoru Iwata, the head programmer at HAL, has spoken on Mach Rider's development and release history. Regardless, this explanation does make sense when considering how generally out of place Mach Rider feels from the rest of the black box games. In addition to the shooting mechanics, Mach Rider's fighting course mode gave the player the ability to choose their path in each stage of the game. There are a total of 10 sectors, each with 2 potential courses to choose from, giving the game solid replayability. These choices didn't differ in difficulty by much, but did serve to make the player feel as if they can customize their play experience. Speaking of customization of play, the game was also launched under the programmable series, rather than the action series. Although it had been almost a year since the release of Excitebike and Wrecking Crew, Mach Rider's manual still bears the haunting phrase, "Save and load menu selections are not operable in this game. They have been programmed in for potential product developments." And just like the other 2 games in the series, there would never be any product developments. Japan got the Famicom data recorder, and America got nothing. Even though a quarter of the game's advertised modes didn't work, it did still have 2 more sections to check out. The Endurance course placed the emphasis on making it a certain distance within the time limit. Solo course was the same as Endurance course, with no enemies. So at least there's some variety in gameplay. Mach Rider also had exceptional music, composed by Hideki Kanazashi, HAL's composer in residence that also made the music for F1 Race. It's been remixed in later Nintendo titles more than once, including Super Smash Bros. Melee, which really made the theme quite iconic. I've been sparse on my criticism of Mach Rider thus far, but there are quite a few issues with the game. The NES does not do a good job of scrolling vertically. It performs significantly smoother when going side to side. But unfortunately, Mach Rider insists on keeping a first-person point of view. This means that, with every extreme turn, of which there are many, the player becomes very disoriented. It becomes significantly more difficult to focus on obstacles or enemies when the course jerks upwards. I don't usually suffer from motion sickness, but playing it for a while did make me a little bit carsick. In addition to this, the removal of the minimap means that, unless you've played through each sector multiple times, you have to rely on reaction times to make it through a stage. On another note, the story of Fighting Course never even sees a finale. It just repeats ad nauseum until the player runs out of lives. Mach Rider didn't have an issue separating itself as a different game from Pole Position, but it did have an issue finding its footing among the other extremely well-designed racing game in the black box set. It's clear which game between the two Nintendo has favored over time. While Excitebike got several features, including an e-reader card pack, GBA port, Mario Kart Course and more, Mach Rider only got an appearance in the Wii and Wii U Virtual Console. That's not to say it wasn't an important title. Nintendo's premier Super Nintendo racing game, 1991's F-Zero, borrowed many of Mach Rider's components. There was a top-down perspective, as the Super Nintendo had a much easier time loading vertically moving graphics. It was also a game that took place far into the future, and while many people credit it as starting the futuristic racing genre as a whole, I would argue that Mach Rider takes home the prize of being the first. That being said, the first is rarely the best, and that certainly holds up here. The other legacy Mach Rider had, at least that I can reason, is that it was one of the first appearances of a partially unclothed woman as a reward for beating a stage. Yep, that is pretty specific. It is important to note that this only happened in the Versus system release of the game. I doubt Nintendo wanted to ruin their squeaky clean image by adding a partially naked woman to their home console version. As each sector is beaten, another small section of the woman, who may or may not be the rider, it's a little bit unclear, is revealed. This is very similar to Metroid's ending, where Samus will take off more clothes depending on the clear time of the game. These two events are probably unrelated, but it is still a silly parallel between the two games. Before we conclude the programmable series as a whole, it's probably a good idea to mention the massive amount of games that included customizable level editors following the NES's success. I'm not attempting to equate correlation and causation here, other than within Nintendo themselves, but there were plenty of other companies that made improvements to the formula. While several games included level editors as gimmicks, including 1990's Game Boy title Cat Trap and 1993's Doom, several titles took a page from Bill Budge's Pinball Construction Set book and were exclusively game creation systems. Arcade Game Construction Kit for the Commodore 64 was a game that sadly launched on a doomed console, but gave those who were interested in game design several ways of dipping their toes into the field. It also included 4 floppy disks, which allowed players to save their work for several projects without having to buy more storage devices. Nintendo also took heavy inspiration from themselves when it came to building levels in games. Several of their most popular franchises have some sort of stage editor, including nearly every game in the Smash Bros. Franchise and several in the New Super Mario Bros. Line. Other games they published made it their entire premise, like WarioWare Do-It-Yourself and the Mario Maker franchise. Not only can these levels be shared online, but they also actually allow the system to save their data, which is a huge step up from 1986. Ultimate Chicken Horse is an online party platformer that implements level editing in a competitive fashion, facing players off against each other. They each attempt to design a level that they can beat, but nobody else can, which flips the standard level editor idea on its head. I haven't played it yet, but the reviews look excellent and it is a fascinating idea for a game. Unfortunately, Mach Rider itself never really took off. Its concept did draw people in, but its gameplay left much to be desired. HAL went on to produce dozens of games for the NES, another of which we will talk about very shortly. They're also responsible for just about every Kirby game made to this day, and still work very closely with Nintendo. Mach Rider was just a bump in the road for them, and that's a perfectly fine thing for it to be.